So, my name is Ted. As you can tell from my thick accent, I'm an American. This is my first trip to Canada, first time leaving the country to do a presentation. So, well, I guess Thursday night would have been the first time. But anyway, so my sisters are all excited because now they can tell all their friends that I travel the world. I give you speaking engagements, so I guess that counts. I got even more excited about coming up to BC when I saw this news article earlier this week. Dick Cheney is apparently afraid of Canada because you're all too dangerous. Poor Dick. Hopefully after the lead up to this, we'll have some time afterwards for questions and answers, but I'd like to get one question out of the way that I know you all have. That yes, my last name really is Cox. Some of you might find it interesting that a straight man with the last name of Cox would pretend to be a gay man who is trying to become a straight man. And so my friends have come up with alternate names for this presentation based on this simple fact, and some of them are undercover Cox, straight Cox goes gay, Cox goes deep. My favorite is Cox talks Cox. Oh, by the way, are my volunteers all here still, 4 of you? Where are my volunteers? Okay, good. Just making sure you didn't think. Anyway, I'd like to warn you all that we'll be dealing with some possibly offensive material this afternoon. So if you find yourself easily offended or sensitive to any kind of material of a sexual nature, now's your chance to leave. You may have heard of ex-gay programs before. These are programs that their intent is to make gay people straight. And they've shown up in popular culture. How many of you have seen But I'm a Cheerleader? 1999. This is the story of a high school girl who's sent off to camp by her parents because she's attracted to other girls. There's an episode of South Park called Cartman Sucks, where poor Butters, and all the shit always happens to Butters, but he inadvertently tells his parents that he's bi-curious, and so they send him to pray the gay away camp. And here's Butters meeting his new roommate. There was an episode of Family Guy titled Family Gay, where Peter gets so far into debt that he starts signing up for scientific experiments so he can make money participating in surveys and things like that. And as one experiment, he's given the gay gene, and it turns him gay. And then Stewie and Brian end up trying to correct his orientation. And then there's this guy, Pastor Ted Haggard from the film Jesus Camp. How many of you have seen this?
The Bible is the Word of God. We don't have to have a general assembly about what we believe. It's written in the Bible. All right? So we don't have to debate about what we should think about homosexual activity. It's written.
What's interesting about Ted Haggard talking about homosexuality is that he was meeting with a male prostitute in a hotel room and smoking methamphetamines. After the scandal broke, he was forced to resign from his church, but a fellow pastor said that after 3 weeks of intensive therapy, Pastor Haggard was now completely heterosexual. And then in 2007, I found this clip of The Daily Show, and this is what got me. So after seeing that program, I became interested in ex-gay programs and went online and started doing research and found that where I was living in California, there were several groups meeting around the area in different churches there. So I started doing more online research and learned that they don't allow outsiders into the programs, and they also don't allow reporters to come into the programs. So increasingly it became apparent that going undercover was the way to find out what happens in ex-gay programs. I also learned that they've been around for many decades, and their history is tied to several different social movements that are all happening at the same time. It starts with the psychiatric community, where homosexuality is considered a mental illness or some kind of psychological disorder. The reason that therapists and counselors consider homosexuality a mental illness is because most people who are gay live in the closet. There are many laws against sodomy in the United States, so people who are gay live in a closeted life because they're afraid of going to prison or being subjected to some kind of psychiatric program. But then in 1957, Dr. Evelyn Hooker, who's a researcher at UCLA, and yes, her name is as funny as mine, she publishes this landmark study where she takes 10 gay men and 10 straight men, and she has both groups undergo different psychological evaluations. And once she gets the results of those tests, she takes the results to 2 different doctors, and she asks the doctors if they can tell the difference. Just looking at the results, can they tell the difference between which men were straight and which men are gay? And it turns out that the doctors were not able to distinguish between the 2 groups. This was one of the first studies of its kind to challenge this idea that homosexuality is a mental disorder. At the same time as researchers are starting to question this issue, the Jesus movement gets started in the 1960s and 1970s, and this is basically hippies finding Jesus. You have a lot of pastors that are reaching out to the counterculture, and they're trying to bring in teenagers into their churches. So to do so, they adopt a lot of things that are popular in counterculture, like rock music. This is why when you go to an evangelical church today, it's very similar to a rock concert, because this is something that started many decades ago where pastors were trying to bring young people into their churches. What's significant about the Jesus movement also is that it introduces this new concept of Christ to American religion. This idea of a personal Jesus who cares about you personally, who knows your name, who can also heal you of any kind of problem you might be having. So many of the hippies that are converting to this new movement, they're finding that through their faith in Christ, they're being healed of sex addiction, drug addiction, alcoholism. And this Jesus movement idea will show up later in ex-gay therapies as well. Then in June of 1969 in New York, the Stonewall riots take place. A bunch of police officers in New York start busting up gay bars in New York. But then several gay men start fighting back and clashing with the police as they're trying to bust up these meeting places. It's this event that gives rise to the modern gay rights movement, and the movement starts spreading across the country. This new movement freaks out the conservative religious groups, and so they find a way to respond against this growing gay rights movement. And one of the ways they do that is through these new ex-gay therapy programs. Love in Action was the first ex-gay therapy to be formed. It was formed in 1973 in San Rafael, California. And it takes this idea of this personal Jesus who can heal you of any kind of problem you might be having, and they apply it to the gay community, saying that this personal Christ, this new Christ who cares about you, knows your name, he can help you overcome these issues that you're having through faith in him. Coincidentally, the same year, the American Psychiatric Association removes homosexuality from its list of mental disorders. It's one of the first mental health institutions or mental health organizations to do that. And this is based off of decades of research following Dr. Hooker's research in 1957. And then in 1975, Reverend Kent Philpott publishes this book, which is called The Third Sex. And it's an interview format with 6 different men and women who say that they were cured of homosexuality through their faith in Christ. After this book is published, it gets passed around to churches all over the U.S., and as it gets passed around, many different groups and churches start forming around these ex-gay therapy attempts, saying that through faith, they can work and cure people of their same-sex attraction. And then in 1976, Michael Bussey calls a conference together. He invites all these different leaders of ex-gay groups around the U.S. He invites them to Southern California. And as a result of that conference, Exodus International was formed. It's still around today. It's the large umbrella group over evangelical Christian ministries that work at these ex-gay programs. They chose the name Exodus because if you know the Old Testament, Exodus is the name of the second book in the Bible. And it's a story of how Moses led the Israelites out of captivity from Egypt. And so they picked the name Exodus because they believe that Jesus can lead you from the captivity of homosexuality. As ex-gay programs grow and become more vocal, they become more popular and more people start hearing about them. In fact, on the cover of Newsweek, John Polk, who met his wife through ex-gay programs, appeared on the cover of Newsweek magazine. Today there are many different ex-gay organizations. Some of them have official groups and some of them are large, others are small and less formal. But these are the major ones. Exodus, as I mentioned earlier, is the umbrella group over evangelical Christian ministries. Evergreen is for Mormons. Courage over there is for Catholics. The ones I want you to remember are these three. Exodus. I attended ministry meetings at 2 different Exodus groups. The International Healing Foundation, that's founded by Richard Cohen, the guy from the Daily Show video who's doing that. So that's his group. And the last one on the bottom is North, which is a very interesting organization. They try to bring scientific legitimacy to ex-gay therapies. So they conduct their own studies, they have their own journals, they set up conferences across the country, especially across the U.S. Sometimes I forget I'm in Canada, so I say across the country when I mean where I live, not country. But anyway, here's a fun fact. Jonah is Jews offering new alternatives to homosexuality. It was actually founded by a convicted felon. This man, Arthur Goldberg, went to federal prison in the U.S. for defrauding Guam and some communities in Illinois. After he got out of prison, he then started up Jonah. And then once the news broke of his prior conviction, he then resigned his position. As I started attending the weekly support meetings at Exodus, I was surprised to learn that the men and women there would not say that they are gay, because they say that being gay is a lifestyle choice. Someone can be attracted to people of the same sex, but being gay means that you identify with that you accept that as your identity, and you choose to live in what they call the gay lifestyle. When you hear ex-gay, it doesn't necessarily mean that someone has been cured of same-sex attraction or that they are no longer attracted to people of the same sex. It means that someone who is ex-gay is someone who rejects that identity and that they are trying to overcome those attractions. And many of the men and women, and this is becoming more popular, will self-identify as SSA or same-sex attracted because they will say, well, I never did identify as gay. I've never been involved with a man or a woman. I've been living a chaste Christian life, so being ex-gay doesn't really apply to me because I never identified as gay. So they will say that they are same-sex attracted, which also means that they will say, well, I'm attracted to people of the same sex, but I'm not gay. They reject this hypothesis that someone is born gay, that there is some kind of biological or genetic influence that causes a person to be gay. Instead, they argue that it is the result of deep emotional or psychological wounds from your childhood. And a great way to illustrate this is with the children's book that I came across. It's called Alfie's House. This kind of shows what the underlying ideas are behind ex-gay movements. We see here Alfie there in the blue shirt, and Alfie has a pretty crappy family life. His siblings are always fighting with each other. Mom and dad are always yelling at each other. His dad is working, but when dad is not working, he's at home yelling at everyone, just making life miserable. When Alfie's father is away at work, his mom is just a little too affectionate with him. She holds him a little too close. She touches him a lot. She's a little emotionally overbearing with him. So Alfie has this situation where he has an abusive father who's often absent and a mother who's a little too emotional and a little too overbearing. But Alfie does have a male role model in his life, and that's his Uncle Pete. And Uncle Pete will come over to spend the night in Alfie's room, and he'll sleep in Alfie's bed and show Alfie where to touch him and how he can be touched. This is basically the underlying idea behind ex-gay therapies, is that the reason that you're attracted to people of the same sex is because of sexual abuse in your past, because of a father who is emotionally abusive or who is absent, or a mother who is a little too strong in your life. But as it turns out, that hypothesis doesn't always hold up. And so a part of ex-gay programs and their ministries, and especially what I saw in meeting with the support groups, was that they try to find out what these issues are in your childhood that are causing you to be attracted to people of the same sex. I remember one young man raised his hand one day and he says, well, I have a great relationship with my parents. I'm close to my father, close to my mother. They've always been very supportive of me. He says, well, what's my issue? And the Christian counselor who was there that day said, well, you see, you only think that you've had a good relationship with your parents. You only think that you have a good, strong family life. The fact that you have these struggles is proof that there's something's not quite right in your family relationships. And ex-gays, survivors of ex-gay programs, will often tell how their family relationships suffered as a result of being in the programs. They spent so many years blaming their parents for their attractions that it did severe damage, even many years after they had left the programs. But of course, there are many different things that are put forward as to what can cause you to be attracted to people of the same sex. I like number 2. If you're hypersensitive, if you have an artistic nature, or other gender non-conforming behaviors. The list continues on number 5, if in your family, if you have any name-calling or put-downs. Number 6, if you are skinnier, larger, shorter, or taller, if you have a lack of hand-eye coordination, if you're a late bloomer, or if you have physical disabilities. The list continues. Number 8, if you are a teacher's pet, if you're non-athletic, if boys get no rough and tumble, or girls get too much rough and tumble, if there's name-calling. My favorite is under number 10. Apparently religion can be a traumatic emotional experience. This is Joe Dallas. He's the former president of Exodus International, and as he explained in his book, like a red light on the dashboard, same-sex attraction indicates something under the hood needs to be checked. Their idea is that same-sex attraction is a symptom. It's not the actual problem. And so they believe by addressing these emotional or psychological wounds, that same-sex attraction will just go away. So in order to do that, there are many different techniques and different things that you can try. Here are some of ones that I came across. First of all, you have to get right with Jesus. This is the idea of the Jesus movement, that in order for Christ to cause these miracles to happen in your life, you have to get your spiritual life in line with Him. And so this was the weekly sheet that we went over every time we had those weekly meetings. And they'd ask us questions like, did you look at pornography? Did you have trouble with masturbation? Did you go into chat rooms? Did you buy Muscle and Fitness? But the first questions that they asked us were, have you spent time alone in the Scriptures and in personal prayer this past week? Or have you prayed for or had any significant prayer times with any of your brothers this past week? So the first questions were asking us about our spiritual well-being. They wanted us to have a spiritual conversion, conversion to Christ first. And then once that was taken care of, then you could work on the other issues. But also, part of the meetings involved some kind of group therapy work, where we would use workbooks or pamphlets or things like that. And this is the one that my group used. It's called Taking Back Ground. And in some of the exercises, they'd ask you questions like, as you were growing up, what were some of the activities that made you feel inferior as a boy or girl, or made you feel like you just didn't fit in? So we would take time and respond to the questions, and then everyone would share their answers and kind of brainstorm and work together. So it was kind of like group work, and like group work in college, it sucks. Control your thoughts. As you go through these programs, many of them are just one night a week, like 3 hours on a Friday night, and the rest of the week you're out working, you're at church, you're just having a normal social life. And so temptations can arise, and so men would share tips on how to stay away from these temptations. One of them was supported by this book, Homosexual No More, and this is why you all have rubber bands this afternoon, because they advocate every time you catch yourself watching someone erotically or engaging in fantasy, snap the band. This will cause a moderate stinging pain, which serves as a shocking reminder of what you are doing. It should help you interrupt the spell. So you are all free to try this yourselves if during this afternoon, if you feel your thoughts are going the wrong way, feel free to snap the band and test it and see if it works for you. I'm saving your souls. You're welcome. But there are also many therapists and counselors through ex-gay therapies. Some of them are licensed, many of them are not. I've found counseling through the Courage website for Roman Catholics, and I had a couple of sessions with the Catholic priest. He surprised me when he told me that actually he didn't really have a lot of experience with this issue, but he tried to help anyway. And he gave me this book, The Courage to be Chaste. And this brings up an interesting point about ex-gay programs. According to Courage, the end goal may not necessarily be heterosexuality. The end goal may be just a lifetime of celibacy or chastity. Through Evergreen or through Exodus International, the idea is that you work towards heterosexuality, getting married and having children and living a heterosexual life. But for Courage, they say that that might not necessarily be possible. So they advocate celibacy as part of their programs. And it turns out that that's just one of the many ways that ex-gay programs disagree with each other as to what's effective, as to what the end goal may be. I'm actually glad that I met with a Catholic priest, because it turns out there are some other stranger therapies out there. This is Alan Downing. He's an ex-gay man who's not a licensed therapist, but he does counseling for ex-gay men and women. As part of his therapies, he would have his clients undress in front of a mirror as he watched, and he would tell his clients to grab their genitals. And he was like, you know, just feel yourself, just feel it for a second so you can grasp your masculinity physically. One of the other techniques that I found was very popular was attending weekend retreats. There are many of these retreats that take place across the world. The one that I attended was called Journey into Manhood. And if I could have my 4 volunteers come up and just line up on this side of the room, please. Journey into Manhood was started by a Mormon man, and he travels around the U.S. He goes to Europe a couple times during the year, and he takes groups about 50 to 60 men at a time to different ranch retreats far away from civilization, often to these dark, lonely country roads. And we go through these emotional exercises to help us deal with same-sex attraction. This is from the informational brochure for Journey into Manhood, and it explains, it gives an example of one of these exercises. You won't just talk about your conflicted feelings about other men. You'll stand eye to eye with them while we help you process whatever feelings arise. So, guys, I'll show you how we did this. Just over here, and then just turn that way. If you could show over here too. And we would stand this close. And guys, if you want to come over as well. So for this exercise, we would split up into 2 lines, and the 2 lines would be facing each other. And then one of the counselors at the program would yell things like, you know, what can you tell yourself about this man? What can you figure out about the way he's dressed? What do you think his fears are? What do you think his hopes are? And then someone would bang a drum, and then the line would rotate so that everyone would eventually end up looking every other man in the eye. So that was one of the introductory exercises. And you guys can move over there. Another one we learned about is something called healing touch therapy. And as I explained to my volunteers before the program began, it's even weirder than it sounds. Healing touch therapy is this idea that because you didn't get affection from your father as a child, you're now trying to get masculine affection in a sexual way as an adult. So they believe that by giving you non-sexual masculine affection, you will no longer want sexual affection from other men. So we learned different healing touch techniques, and these are some of the rules for healing touch therapy. You should be held or hugged by men who don't experience same-sex attraction whenever possible. You can request holding in your men's support group. You should do holding with 3 or more men present, because things are much less likely to go wrong if there are 3 men holding and touching each other. You should do holding while fully clothed, any positions that are non-sexual in nature. So, for example, not in a bed, no lying down. So, what's your name? Jordan. Jordan, why don't you come here to the front of the room? So we're going to say that Jordan here needs this masculine touch that he didn't get as a child from his father. So Jordan, I'd like you to sit down and point your feet towards the back of the room. Okay. And your name?
Brian.
Brian. Brian, if you come over here. And Brian's going to represent this masculine father figure that Jordan didn't get as a child. So I'd like you to sit down next to him and again with your feet out towards the back. Should I have him? Can you guys see in the back? Okay. What I'd like you to do is scoot over just a little bit, like that. No, you're the one being healed. So. And go ahead and place your arm around. There we go. Now, as we need 3 or more people present, guys, if you could come over here and give Jordan your masculine healing touch. You can touch him on his arms. You can sit down. So as you can see, we are following all the rules here. We have 3 or more men. Everyone's fully clothed. This is a non-sexual position. This was the first hold that we were taught, and it's called the side-by-side hold, because you can see the giver and the receiver are side-by-side. Now, Brian, right?
Yeah.
If you could open up your legs like that. Or this is for one of the other positions we were taught. And Jordan, if you would take your place in between his legs. And Jordan, I'd like you to scoot back a little bit. And just lean back. There you go. Right, if you put your arms around. And we need groups of 3 or more, so guys. I'm feeling the wrong guy. Right. This hold is called the motorcycle. And so what happened is there were about 50 men in this room in a ranch in Arizona, and they turned down the lights and played this song, which I'm going to play for you. And as I was being motorcycled, the counselor was sharing some positive affirmations with me, which I'd like to share with you. And then after the counselor said these words in my ear, the whole group all sang together. So I was wondering if you guys would be willing to sing this afternoon. All right. So let me share with you first the words from the counselor. Jordan, long ago, you were the golden child. And you were happy and life was good and you played outside. But long ago, someone hurt you. Someone hurt you and you put up walls to protect yourself. And Jordan, we do honor those walls because they did protect you and they were good. But now, here, you need to let those walls down. Let the walls down, Jordan. And so, after the counselor shared those words with me, we all broke out into song. And I hope you guys can sing really loud. I hope. The words are on the screen. How could anyone tell you? I can't hear you. You were anything less than beautiful. How could anyone ever tell you? You can sing louder. You were less than whole. How could anyone fail to notice that your loving is a miracle? How deeply you're connected to my soul. Let's give a round of applause to the volunteers.
Nice to meet you.
So,
seem very non-sexual.
you all have the rubber bands. Besides healing and touching and cuddling and singing to each other, we also did some emotional exercises where we talked about bad memories from our past, bad memories from our fathers. One young man shared a story about when he was a child, his father was reading the newspaper. And when he was a kid, he was trying to get his dad's attention, but his dad brushed him off and said, "No, leave me alone, I'm busy." And the counselor who was running this exercise said, "Well, you see, what happened that day is your father gave you this message that he doesn't care for you, that he doesn't have time for you, that the newspaper is more important than his own child." And the counselor said, "So what we're going to do is we're going to help you get rid of these old messages that you've been carrying around for so many years." So we had this young man kneel down in front of the room and gave the man a baseball bat, and then put a punching bag in front of him. And then standing across from the man who was kneeling was another one of the counselors, and he was pretending to read a newspaper, and he was saying things like, "I don't care for you, I don't have time for you, you're not important to me." And the counselor running this exercise said to the young man, "Well, we're going to help you get rid of these old messages from your old father, so swing away." And the rest of the group watched as this young man had to pretend to beat his own father to death with a baseball bat. And then, after the counselor was lying on the ground, crumpled as if he were dead, there was another man standing behind him, and he had his arms out, spread open, and he was saying things like, "Son, I love you. Son, I care about you. Son, I have time for you." Healing touch therapy was actually started by Richard Cohen, the guy from the Daily Show video. This also goes to what I was telling you about how ex-gay programs don't exactly agree among themselves as to what kind of techniques work and which techniques don't. Richard Cohen was invited to a conference put on by Exodus International where he was able to share some of his techniques. This is what one observer said. During that class which I attended, he asked for a volunteer to demonstrate on. His volunteer was a seasoned Exodus leader. This leader was instructed by Mr. Cohen to lay on the floor and spread his legs wide open. Dr. Cohen then laid down on top of this other man face to face and embraced him. Mr. Cohen made the comment, "This might cause some stimulation. However, what goes up must come down, I always say." Now, it might interest you to know that Mr. Cohen was actually kicked out of the American Counseling Association for having inappropriate relations with the client. He is no longer licensed by any type of mental health body, yet for some reason, CNN, major news network, decided to have him on as a psychotherapist and an expert in the field of sexual reorientation. Many of these programs do charge large amounts of money, especially the retreats and especially the counselors. The weekly meetings that I attended were usually free. They'd ask for donations for coffee and donuts or things like that. But if you start seeing a therapist or if you go off to the retreats, the cost becomes quite large. The group that I attended, Journey into Manhood, charges $650 for 48 hours. Including airfare, I paid about $1,000 for the entire weekend. And so while going straight ain't cheap, in some cases you might actually be paying for it. Turns out that Michelle Bachman's husband runs a Christian counseling center in the United States, and he offers ex-gay therapies. His clinic has received over $161,000 in state and federal funding to support his clinic programs. And you might be asking yourself, does any of this work? Are there any instances of this actually benefiting anyone? The American Counseling Association weighed in on the issue a couple of years ago with this pamphlet, where they discuss ex-gay therapy programs. And they write, "The most important fact about these therapies is that they are based on a view of homosexuality that has been rejected by all the major mental health professions." And they go on to list all the different groups that have rejected ex-gay therapies, saying that together, representing more than 480,000 mental health professionals, have all taken the position that homosexuality is not a mental disorder and thus is not something that needs to or can be cured. But come on, these are all scientific groups, right? I mean, what do scientists know about anything? I mean, they're probably liberals, they're probably feminists, vegans. Can we really trust what they say? What about the people in ex-gay programs? What do they say? Earlier, I told you about this book, which started off the ex-gay movement, The Third Sex, with interviews of 6 people who were cured through Christ. Well, a few years after the book was published, 4 of the people interviewed in the book sued the publisher, saying that they had not actually been changed, that they were not actually straight. As a result of that lawsuit, the book was pulled from the market and is no longer available for purchase, unless you can find an old copy on eBay, which I did. I told you about Michael Bussey, the man who formed Exodus International in 1976. He called the conference of all the ex-gay leaders together and formed this umbrella group. Well, he started touring the country, sharing his story about how he came out of homosexuality. But he wasn't touring alone. One of his Exodus co-founders, by the name of Gary Cooper, went with him as they both addressed churches together. Eventually, though, the 2 of them fell in love. They both left their wives, and they got married. I told you about John Paul, who appeared on the cover of Newsweek with his arm around his wife. 2 years after this photo was taken, he was spotted in a gay bar in Washington, D.C. by gay rights activists. They recognized him from Newsweek. And as he was called out and fled the bar, one of the activists took a picture of him as he fled. As a result of this picture, he was forced to resign. This is Dr. George Riekers. Dr. Rieker is an interesting character, mostly for that mustache. But he has been a board member at NARTH, which was that scientific or pseudo-scientific organization I mentioned earlier, which tries to kind of bring scientific legitimacy to ex-gay programs. He's also been a part of the Conservative Family Research Council, which is notable because they don't actually produce any research. And then a few years ago, the state of Florida paid him $60,000 to testify against allowing gay adoption in that state. Now, just a few months ago, or maybe a couple years ago, Dr. Riekers was spotted flying home from a European vacation, where he was accompanied by this young man whose face has been blurred out. Turns out that that young man has a profile on the website rentboy.com. Here's his profile. He's available for massage, good times, travel, escort for days, nights, and weekends. When Dr. Riekers was confronted as to why he would go to Europe for a week with a male escort, Dr. Riekers said he had no idea that the man was a prostitute and said, "I have surgery and I can't lift luggage, that's why I hired him." Stephen Colbert said apparently Dr. Riekers has trouble lifting his sack. I told you earlier about Pastor Ted Haggard, who after 3 weeks of intensive therapy was now claiming to be completely heterosexual. Last year he told GQ magazine, "Here's where I really am on this issue. I think that probably if I were 21 in this society, I would identify myself as a bisexual." This is Alan Chambers. He is the current president of Exodus International. And at a gathering of ex-gay men, he told them, "And then I came to the place where I realized, you know what? God calls us as Christians to a life of denial. I love that today I realize that I do live a life of denial. Not denial of who I used to be, not denial of who I could be today, but I deny what comes naturally to me. And so every single morning, this is a ritual for me. I wake up and I say, 'Dear Lord, I can't make it today without you. I choose to deny what comes naturally to me. I choose to submit my will to the Lordship of your Son, Jesus Christ, and I choose better.'" Just a couple of months ago, Mr. Chambers was invited to participate in a panel that was discussing homosexuality in the Christian church. And he said during the panel discussion, "The majority of people that I have met, and I would say the majority meaning 99% of them, had not experienced a change in their orientation or have gotten to a place where they could say that they could never be tempted or not tempted in some way to experience some level of same-sex attraction." Now, we talk a lot about religion and faith and the Jesus movement, and so when talking about ex-gay programs, it's also important to understand where the Bible weighs in on this issue. If you speak to someone who belongs to a conservative religious group, eventually the Bible will come up. And probably one of the most important stories, the big story that's used to condemn homosexuality, is the story of Sodom and Gomorrah. How many of you know this story? All right. This is the story that takes place in the book of Genesis. These slides actually come from the bricktestament.com. The Reverend Smith at that website gave me permission to use these images. Here we have, the story usually goes like this. Lot is standing outside of the city walls of Sodom when two angels come down, and they come to Lot and they say, "Well, we need a place to stay for the night." And so Lot says to the angels, "Well, why don't you come to my place? We can have dinner, you can stay the night with me and my family." So Lot invites them into his home, and they have dinner together. Outside of Lot's house, a crowd gathers. And this crowd is quite pissed off. And they say, "Where are the men who came to you tonight? Bring them out to us so that we may have sex with them." In other words, this crowd wants to gang rape these angels, which is a hell of a way to welcome people into your city. I'm not sure what they're thinking, but I guess that's what they did. Lot, he goes outside his home and he addresses the crowd and he says, "My brothers, please don't gang rape my angel visitors." The crowd gets pissed off. They go after Lot. Lot gets pulled inside by the angels at the last minute. The next morning, the angels take Lot and his family outside of the city walls, and they warn Lot and his family, "The city's going to be destroyed, so run away, and whatever you do, don't turn around." So God destroys Sodom and Gomorrah, and that's what's left over. Lot's wife turns around, and she is turned into a pillar of salt. And so at the end of the story, we have Lot and his two daughters who survive while the rest of the city is destroyed. So that's one way the story goes. But scholars point out some important facts about sexuality in the Bible. You notice that homosexuality is not mentioned anywhere in the Ten Commandments. And in fact, Jesus Christ himself, the Lord of all, the Savior of mankind, here's what he says about the subject. This is a direct quote. "Nothing." scholars point out that there are more than 3,000 verses in the Bible that deal with issues such as poverty, the downtrodden, income inequality. That seems to be more of a focus in the Bible, but there are very few verses in the Bible that actually talk about homosexuality. Here's one of those verses that seems to address the issue. Do not lie with a man as one lies with a woman. That is detestable. But if you'll notice something, in the very same paragraph we are warned, do not approach a woman to have sexual relations during the uncleanness of her monthly period. Conservative religious groups don't seem to be pushing any type of way to outlaw period sex. I don't know why. It's in the same fucking paragraph. It's not hard to miss. Scholars say that the key to understanding these verses lies here. As one lies with a woman, telling men, do not penetrate a man. According to the authors of the Bible, the gender role of men is being superior, their job is to penetrate. And women, being inferior, are to be penetrated. Men fuck, women get fucked. That's the way that God set things up. So for a man to penetrate another man is to rob him of his gender superiority. It's to take a male and make him female. That is the great sin, according to the authors of the Bible. See, this is what conservative religious groups get very wrong. It's not that God hates fags. God hates women. And God hates it when men become women and give up their superior gender role. In fact, the best example of this that I like is in the Sodom and Gomorrah story from the Old Testament. How many of you know that I skipped certain parts? Okay, I had to do that. I'm sorry. Here's the rest of the story. We'll go back to where the group is outside of Lot's house, and they're all pissed off that Lot has these visitors, and they want to gang rape the visitors. Lot goes outside, and he says, please, my brothers, do not be evil. I have 2 virgin daughters. Why don't you gang rape them instead? Don't be evil by raping these men. Gang rape my 2 virgin daughters. I mean, there we see the status of women, that it would be awful for these visitors to be robbed of their male gender superiority, but it's just fine to do that to a woman. Later on in the story, after the cities are destroyed, Lot is in the cave with his daughters, and his daughters realize that there's no other man around to help them continue their father's bloodline. So they decide to get their father drunk and have sex with him. You'll never look at Legos the same way. And then the next night, it's the second daughter's turn, so they get their father drunk again, and the second daughter goes in for a reverse Lego cowgirl. But there we see, even in the Sodom and Gomorrah story, which is purportedly about homosexuality and how much God hates gays, it's really about gender roles and how you treat visitors. It's not so much about sexual orientation. In fact, we even see that issue in ex-gay programs. And this is why I bring in the Bible to this, because this idea of gender roles in the Bible is actually what ex-gay programs are really all about. I went to Journey into Manhood thinking that they were trying to turn us from boys into men, but it turns out they're actually working on the issue of gender confusion. One of the counselors told us, we are all attracted to the opposite sex. Some of us are just confused by which is the opposite sex. And as I continue on, I'll show you more of these examples where the real issue for ex-gay programs is about gender identity and gender confusion. This leads to an interesting question about ex-gay programs. Do women attend? And yes, there are some women who do attend ex-gay programs, but they're predominantly attended by men. Almost all of those weekend retreats are designed for men. We're not exactly sure why that is. I've spoken with some experts who have done research into ex-gay programs, but it seems to be that ex-gay programs are much more concerned about men and their sexuality. They're more concerned with men maintaining their gender superiority and not so much concerned about women, because women are second-class citizens anyway, so what does it matter if a woman has sex with another person who's also of that second-class role? But now for some bad news. Some people will ask, well, what's the big deal if a man or a woman decides that they are not happy with their sexual identity and they want to change? And that may be a valid point. People do have the right to self-identify. But it turns out that when you believe that homosexuality is wrong, immoral, if it's a mental illness, if it's something that can be fixed, that leads to exploitation of very vulnerable populations. And you can see this even outside of ex-gay programs. For example, in Australia, a father who believed that his son was gay hired a prostitute and forced his son to have sex with her while he watched. In South Africa, lesbians are being pulled out of their homes and gang raped in the streets in order to correct them of their sexual orientation. In Malaysia, government officials and teachers are sending boys that are acting effeminately to masculinity camps to make them more masculine. And then this video of a church in Connecticut released this video of an exorcism.
Fox 7's Lori Perez went to Bridgeport today to try and ask Manifested Glory Ministries about what we see on the tape.
Right now, I command you to leave.
It is a frantic scene, a teen writhing as the adults around him implore homosexual demons to get out.
Right now, in the name of Jesus, I call my homosexuality right now, in the name of Jesus.
For 20 minutes, it continues with the boy in a near seizure, even vomiting. By the looks of it and the repeated references to his sexuality, it appears to be a gay exorcism.
But even within ex-gay programs, there are many instances of exploitation, especially of young people, where parents are sending their children through these programs against their will. This is Caleb Brundage. He was one of the counselors at Journey into Manhood. I had a chance to speak with him for quite some time when I was there. He was one of the referral therapists for Richard Cohen's International Healing Foundation. And he's also a minister at XP Ministries based out of Phoenix. And he creates worship music, and I actually found a video of some of the music he makes. Yeah, he throws raves for Jesus.
This generation is hungry for the mysteries of God. This generation longs to experience God in a way, in an abandoned way, like never before.
I don't know if there's E for Jesus, but if there is, I want to try that. Mr. Brundage is also involved in a mortuary ministry where he and other volunteers will go to funeral homes in the Phoenix area, and they will offer to pray over the bodies of the deceased, telling family members that if we pray hard enough, we can bring your loved ones back to life. Don't think they've had a lot of success. I'm sure we'll find out if they do. But after Journey into Manhood, about a couple months after I met him, Mr. Brundage traveled to Uganda, and this is a photograph that was taken during his trip there. He was accompanied by this man, Don Schmier, who is a former board member of Exodus International. Mr. Schmier is the author of An Ounce of Prevention, Preventing the Homosexual Condition in Today's Youth. And he was also accompanied by Scott Lively. Scott Lively is the author of The Pink Swastika. You can read this online at thepinkswastika.com. He argues in this book that the Nazi Party was founded, organized, and run by gay men, and that they were the people responsible for the Holocaust. You can go online and read it yourself. I'm not making this up. He's also the author of 7 Steps to Recruit Your Child, A Parent's Guide to Protecting Children from Homosexuality and the Gay Movement. So these 3 men traveled to Uganda to participate in this conference. This is a photograph of Mr. Brundage as he was sharing his testimony. He shared how he had come out of homosexuality. The 3 men warned the people of Uganda that gay rights activists were paying children to say that they were gay, so that the gay rights community could artificially inflate the number of gay people in the country. The 3 of them were interviewed by newspapers and radio stations. They spoke at conferences, at churches. We also know that they had some connections with members of the Ugandan parliament while they were there. And we don't have all of the details, but we do know that is one of the consequences of that conference was the drafting of the Anti-Homosexuality Bill of 2009. How many of you have heard of this bill? In its original form, this bill would sentence to death HIV-positive men who are caught having sex with other men. It would also send people to prison for not reporting homosexual activity in their communities, and it would also send people to prison who are involved in AIDS-related or HIV health causes. When asked about his involvement with this bill, Scott Lively said that it was the nuclear bomb against the gay movement. And he said, "I hope the nuclear bomb spreads across the whole world against the gay movement, against this attempt to overthrow family-based society and replace it with sexual anarchy." Just a couple days ago, the New York Times ran a story that said that Ugandan gay rights activists were now suing Mr. Lively here in the United States for his involvement with anti-gay activities in their country. So it'll be interesting to see where that goes. How many of you have heard of Day of Silence? All right, this is a project that involves university and high school students where they will tape their mouths shut for a day. And it's trying to call attention to how LGBT youth are bullied into silence or how they are harassed against speaking out in their schools. So students will tape their mouths shut or they won't speak for the entire day to call attention to this issue. We'll focus on the family, which has some strong ties with the ex-gay movement, has created their own day, which they call Day of Dialogue, which you'll notice will be held the day before Day of Silence this year, where they are encouraging Christian students to speak out about the biblical truth, as they call it, about God and sexuality. NARTH is that scientific or pseudo-scientific organization I've been mentioning. They advocate that if parents are afraid that their toddlers are acting a little too effeminately, that they can take them to gender reorientation therapies. That children as young as 3 years old can be taken by their parents to act a little more masculine. One of the proponents of this type of therapy is Dr. Joseph Nicolosi. I don't know if you have the Dr. Phil show up here.
Sadly.
Dr. Nicolosi has twice been a guest on Dr. Phil's show where he has advocated for his success in gender reorientation therapies. This letter was recently mailed out to school superintendents and school counselors by the American College of Pediatricians. And in this letter, the American College of Pediatricians writes, "In dealing with adolescents experiencing same-sex attraction, it is essential to understand there is no scientific evidence that an individual is born gay or transgender." And then later on it says, "It is also critical to understand that these conditions can respond well to therapy." Now, red flags should be going up right now. You might be thinking, wait, why the hell would the American College of Pediatricians be saying that these conditions respond well to therapy? Well, if you're confused, that's understandable because the American College of Pediatricians, which sent out the letter, is not the American Academy of Pediatrics. The American Academy of Pediatrics is composed of licensed counselors and therapists, while the American College of Pediatricians, some of their former board members include Joseph Nicolosi, who advocates therapy on toddlers at NARTH, George Riekers, the man who was caught in Europe with Rent Boy, and Arthur Goldberg, the man who served federal prison in for defrauding Guam and Illinois before starting Jonah. So if you're confused, you can see how a school superintendent or a school teacher might also be confused by that information. This young man shared the story of how after his parents found emails between himself and his boyfriend, his parents forced him to attend an ex-gay camp, saying that if he did not attend, they would pull all his funding for his education. DJ Butler was forced to attend a camp after his parents learned that he was gay. His father put him in handcuffs, threw him in the family car, and then drove him to Love in Action, where one of the therapists told him that if he leaves, I'll call the cops, and they'll come pick you up and take you to a juvenile delinquent center. Desert Stream is another ex-gay therapy group for youth. It turned out that one of the counselors there was sexually abusing at least one young person under his care. One young man at Kansas State University shared what happened after his parents learned that he was gay. They took him to a Christian counselor who started using aversion therapy techniques where he would show the young man images of men holding or embracing each other. But first, after he was seated, each of his hands was strapped to the arm of the chair, and then softball-sized ice blocks were placed in each palm. Then photos of men touching appeared on the screen. At times, a heterosexual couple was shown, and the ice was removed. The ice was left on his palms, causing freezing pain, as many photos of homosexual men were shown. But this technique didn't have as much of an effect as the counselor liked, so the counselor decided to show this man even more explicit images. The men were embracing, or perhaps kissing on the cheek, and Swanson received intense amounts of heat transferred through gel pads applied to his hand. Now it was the burn sensation, Swanson said. I still had for a few years a huge pink mark across my hand because it would literally burn your skin. But that didn't work. So the counselor used even more explicit images. Very, very thin needles were inserted into my fingers, on all 10 fingers, still strapped down, and then the rest of my body was strapped down because they knew what was going to happen. As the man turned on the electricity, the pain was so horrible, Swanson still cannot understand why his mother sat in the lobby and did not race to rescue him as he screamed. This is Stuart Mattis. He was born and raised in the Mormon church. This is a photograph taken when he was a missionary in Italy. He struggled with same-sex attraction his entire life. But as the Mormon church began fighting against gay marriage in California in the year 2000, he became so depressed that he went to the footsteps of his local church, and with a handgun, he ended his own life. He wrote in his suicide note, "The church has no idea that as I type this letter, there are surely boys and girls on their calloused knees, imploring God to free them from their pain. They hate themselves. They retire to bed with their fingers pointed to their heads in the form of a gun. I am now free. I am no longer in pain, and I no longer hate myself. As it turns out, God never intended for me to be straight. Hopefully my death might be a catalyst for some good." Many times, as I share these presentations, people in the audience will ask, well, what do we do about this? How do we get involved? And so I've started compiling some resources of different groups that you can get involved with, and I'd like to share those with you today. Soul Force is a group of liberal Christians that each year conduct what's called the Equality Ride, where they have college students get on these tour buses and they travel around the U.S. going to conservative Christian colleges where they will have quiet protests against gay rights suppression or in support of gay rights issues. I just learned a couple days ago that the protesters were arrested when they went to the Mormon-owned Brigham Young University in Provo, Utah. But they are looking for volunteers to take part in the Equality Ride. So if you are a Christian who supports gay rights issues, this is one group you might want to look into. The Trevor Project is a suicide hotline for LGBT youth, and they are always looking for volunteers to be there when someone calls in looking for hope. I told you about Day of Silence. They are always trying to organize on new campuses to have more people participate. Anyone here part of Out on Campus? All right, yay! So this is the group here at Simon Fraser University. There are many resources there. They have many programs that are going on. I believe this week was
Queer Awareness Week.
Queer Awareness Week, okay. And then also here in Vancouver is Community. And at the end, I'll have some links for you to copy down if you'd like. But one of the best things that you can do is to speak out about this issue. If you are a member of the LGBT community, one of the best things that you can do personally is to come out. Now, I don't want to stand up here with my straight white male privilege and just say come out. I understand that that carries significant personal risk, and so I don't want to be flippant about that. But coming out can be very good in helping people change their minds. Research has shown that people who know someone who is gay or lesbian is much more likely to support gay rights. But I also believe that if you don't identify as queer, that you should also come out in support of gay rights issues. You should speak out about this issue. You should get involved in programs, go to Gay Pride, participate in the activities that are going on your campus. Because when it comes to the gay agenda, this is really it. I mean, this is what it's all about. It's not gay rights, it's about human rights. And when you think about it, when you talk about human sexuality, is there really a big difference between being gay, or straight, or lesbian, or bisexual, or queer? I mean, can we really draw lines between the differences between all of those labels? I mean, aren't we all at least a little bit gay? To illustrate this, I'd like to end this afternoon with something from one of my favorite comedians by the name of Ron White. And I think he really gets at this point.
I was talking to a buddy of mine the other day. I have a friend he's a homophobe. Isn't that the most useless thing you could possibly be, is afraid of gay people? And I was talking to him the other day, and he goes, man, this world would be better if there wasn't so many queers. And I'm like, you know what, the next time you have a thought let it go. I go, we're all gay. It's just to what extent are you gay? He goes, that's bullshit, man. I ain't gay at all. I'm like, yeah, you are, and I can prove it. He goes, fine, prove it. I'm like, all right, do you like porn? He goes, yeah, I love porn. You know that. I'm like, oh, do you only watch scenes with two women together? He goes, no, I watch a man and a woman making love. I'm like, oh, do you like the guy to have a small, half-flaccid penis? He goes, no, I like big, hard, throbbing cock.
Check. All right, thank you for coming out this afternoon. I appreciate your time, and thank you for your patience in getting everything together. So here are the links of some of the organizations that I was talking about earlier. If you have one of those fancy smartphones, you can just snap the QR code and all of the links will pop up that way for you. I'm on this website called Facebook, you might have heard of it, where you can follow some of my other writing projects. I do cover gay rights issues quite often, and I'm also involved in a lot of, or several projects about conservative religious groups, because I just find them fucking fascinating. So anyway, any questions?